Alan.
Thank you very much, Judge Hammond. I don't know if this, can you hear me all? Or sorry. How does this thing go? There it is. Yeah, there it is. There we go. Okay. Well, it's a great pleasure to be back in Michigan among so many friends, and I do have friends here that I've known since my first appearance in the state back in 1984, when the NEA book was first published. And of course, that's a good 6 years ago, and I predicted that things would get worse, but nobody could have possibly predicted how much worse they would get. But things have gotten worse, and we expect them to get much worse than they are today. So that's the way it is, and everything that you read, all of the prognostications indicate that beyond a shadow of a doubt that the public school system is going to get far worse, and we're going to be in far greater trouble in the years ahead. But you know, it's always good to know history. And I have the advantage of being old, so I've lived through a great deal of it. The younger people today don't realize how things were back in the old days when I went to school. But let me read to you something that was in Collier's magazine, an article, Why Don't They Teach Children to Read? This was in Collier's. Collier's doesn't exist anymore. That shows you how far back this goes. November 26, 1954. 1954, that's 36 years ago. This was what this author said. He wrote, "The man next to me in the airport bus entering Pasco, Washington said, 'My 6-year-old reads words at school and can't read the same words when I point them out at home in the newspaper. In school today, the children aren't taught to read, they're taught to memorize.' A man in the seat ahead chimed in, 'Everything is pictures. My youngster's in the 6th grade. He'll still come across a word like pasture, and he remembers a picture in his early reader and calls it meadow.' Neither passenger knew I was making a national study of modern education. They volunteered their remarks, sharing something they were concerned and troubled about. Like them, thousands of other American parents with first-grade children who are not catching on to reading as taught by the modernists, and those with upper-grade children handicapped by lack of a solid reading foundation are concerned and puzzled. But most of all, they are puzzled. Why is reading taught this way? 1,000 times one hears the question, why don't they teach my child to read? How can schools tolerate a method which turns out many children of 8, 9, and older who stare helplessly at a word not on their memory list and cannot make a stab at reading it? What has happened to the method of teaching reading sound by sound, syllable by syllable, so that a child can at least make a reasonable attempt at reading any word? Two basic teaching methods are in conflict here. One is the phonetic method, known as phonics, the old-fashioned way in view of modern educators. They are likely to call it the spit and spatter or grunt and groan method, satirizing the way youngsters try to sound out letters and syllables. The other method, which the modernists have put into vogue, is the word memory plan, also known as sight reading, total word configuration, or word recognition. It has the more friendly nickname of look and say, since the youngster is supposed to simply look at a word and say it right out. He memorizes the shape of the word, the configuration, and identifies it with pictures in his workbook. Often he is taught to recognize phrases or whole sentences in his picture book or on flash poster cards before he can independently sound out and pronounce each simple word as cat or ball. The fundamental difference in approach in the two methods reaches deep into philosophy and scientific theory. Thinkers have wrangled for centuries over which comes first, the whole or its parts. An argument perhaps as endless as that over the priority of the chicken or the egg. The phonics advocates say the parts come first. The word memory people say we start with the whole and the parts fall into place in due course. That was written in 1954. You would think that by now the problem would have been solved. 36 years ago, this man identified the problem perfectly. This is a year before Dr. Rudolph Flesch came out with his book, Why Johnny Can't Read. And in Why Johnny Can't Read, Rudolph Flesch told the American people, well, the reason why the kids aren't reading is because they're using this new look-say method of teaching reading. And he told the reader, he said that back in the early 1930s, the professors of education changed the way reading is taught in American schools. They threw out the alphabetic phonics method, which is the proper way to teach children to read an alphabetic writing system. And they put in this new look, say, whole word, or sight method that teaches children to read English as if it were Chinese, an ideographic writing system. And he said when you impose an ideographic teaching method on an alphabetic writing system, you get reading disability. Very clear. That was 1955, a year after this article was written in 54. So that's 35 years ago. Now you would think that the battle, the debate would be settled. But here we come to Education Week. This is the official newspaper that goes to educators all over the country. Here's the Xerox of it. Front page, March 21st, 1990. From a great debate to a full-scale war, dispute over teaching reading heats up. See that? It's now heating up. In 1967, one of the most prominent researchers in reading instruction, Jean S. Schall, analyzed the controversy that was then raging in the field in an influential book called The Great Debate. Today, nearly a quarter of a century later, the Harvard University scholar says the debate not only persists, but has in fact escalated to a full-scale war. The battle lines are drawn between advocates of phonics, who stress the importance of teaching the relationships between letters and sounds, and those of whole language methodology, who believe children should be taught reading by reading whole texts. And so fierce have their arguments become that two recent attempts to find a common ground, a federally funded study and a proposal for the 1992 National Assessment, have not only failed to quell the debate, but may have exacerbated it. It's always been in reading that there was a restraint with all our fighting, Ms. Schall says. Now it's as if all restraints are gone. All restraints are gone. They are out to destroy literacy in this country once and for all. And they mean it. Today they call it whole language. In the old days they called it look, say, sight reading. It's basically the same thing. You want a good description of whole language? It was given to us by the Washington Post, November 29th, 1986. Reading method lets pupils guess. Whole language approach riles advocates of phonics. The most controversial aspect of whole language is the de-emphasis on accuracy. American Reading Council President Julia Palmer, an advocate of the approach, said it is acceptable if a young child reads the word house for home or substitutes the word pony for horse. It's not very serious because she understands the meaning, said Palmer. Accuracy is not the name of the game. Accuracy is not the name of the game. And this is what is being taught now in virtually all the primary schools in America, and they are phasing out phonics as fast as they dare. As fast as they can get away with it. They are phasing it out. Because they want to make sure that, well, as few people learn to read in this country as possible. Now you would think that by now, after 36 years, that article in Collier's, and 35 years after Rudolph Flesch, after Jean Schall's book was written 25 years ago, that the educators would change, would see the errors in their ways. But instead, we now have to live with this problem of illiteracy. Here's something, an editorial that was in Air Force magazine. 27 million Americans over the age of 17 are functionally illiterate. Another 45 million are marginally literate, usually unable to function productively in a work environment, according to the Business Council for Effective Literacy. Projecting from current data, the U.S. Census Bureau says that 70% of the U.S. population will be functionally illiterate by the year 2000. 70%. Here's an article from the Patriot Ledger of November 1887. 3.1 million in California functionally illiterate. 3.1 million in California. And you know what the superintendent of schools in California has mandated in the primary schools? Whole language. That's their solution to the problem. Accuracy is not the name of the game. Oh, it's the name of the game for the Japanese and the Koreans and the Germans, but not for us. Incidentally, it's even the name of the game for the Russians. I did a newsletter entitled Why Ivan Can Read But Johnny Can't. Do you know that the look-say method was tried in Russia? Right after the revolution, Madame Krupskaya, Lenin's wife, adopted the progressive program for the schools of Russia. See, they had this big revolution, and they decided to adopt John Dewey's techniques of teaching reading. Well, the situation was so bad, became so awful, that in 1932, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union threw out the look-say method, threw out the entire progressive program, and got back to a traditional phonetic method of teaching reading and to a traditional subject matter form of education. You know why? Because they wanted engineers and technicians and scientists to build the world's greatest military machine. You couldn't do it with functional illiterates. They knew it. So they went back to traditional teaching, and the result is that in the Soviet Union you have a highly literate population. As a matter of fact, throughout the Eastern Bloc, everybody learned to read very well. So you have highly literate people there, and you can't stop highly literate people from reading what they want to read. You know, the Iron Curtain was like a sieve. Things did get through. And they managed to read Jefferson and Lincoln. You see, in the Soviet Union, their form of censorship was, you know, you can't publish such books. But books managed to get in, and people managed to read them. They even read between the lines. For example, in books that were anti-religious, people found religion because they had to quote the Bible, believe it or not. The most effective form of censorship is illiteracy, and that's the kind we're getting in the United States. The most effective form of illiteracy. These are youngsters who will not be able to read their Declaration of Independence or their Constitution, and their freedom will be taken away and they won't even know what happened. That's what the future is shaping up as. Now, our educators knew about the Russian experiment because they were involved in it, and they were greatly disappointed. They were greatly disappointed in 1932 when the communists reversed their education program. But then the American educators put it in American schools. They knew it didn't work in Russia, but they put it in American schools. Do you think they know what they're doing? Do you think all of this is happening by accident, that these poor people are just groping in the dark? I just told you how many functional illiterates they have in California. Here's New York State. Let's see, a commission, a Senate commission, placed the number of functionally illiterate adults in New York at 2.8 million, and said that number will increase by 15% to about 3.3 million by 1992 if nothing is done. Listen to that, if nothing is done. They have compulsory school attendance in New York State. Isn't that something? Everybody's got to go to school in New York State. What do they mean by, you mean forcing kids to stay in school for 10 and 12 years is nothing? Because they're already doing that. And they have whole language in New York State, too, that's getting into the schools. So what do you think the reform is going to be like? What do you think the problem is going to be like in 5 years from now? Here's an interesting article. Americans finish last in International Spelling Bee. September 13th, 1989. We're last in the spelling bee. Our kids can't spell. Here's another article. Hundreds of job applicants can't read, write, or add. Another article from USA Today. David Kearns, the chairman of the Xerox Corporation. He says he denounced the public schools as a failed monopoly producing workers with a 50% defect rate. Businesses must hire workers who can't read, write, or count, he said, then spend $25 billion a year to train them. I wish that Mr. Kearns would attend a meeting like this. You know where he's getting his advice from? The educational leaders. What kind of advice are you going to get from them? They're the ones who have created this problem. They're the ones who are perpetuating the problem because they have their agenda. Their agenda is a world socialist government. And the only way that you can get Americans to give up their freedom is to make them stupid enough so that they don't understand the value of freedom. This nation is being dumbed down to the point where the average American will have the intellect of the hillbilly. It doesn't take much to do that, as we're seeing, together with TV, MTV, music. We're getting there very quickly, and the restraints are off, remember. The educators mean business. They're not going to listen to me. They're going to try to prevent people like you from hearing people like me. You represent the only independents in this country, the only people who have minds of your own, at least willing to hear the other side. But how many out there are listening to us or even are interested in listening to us? Here's an article that was in the Tucson Citizen in June 2nd, 1987. Young failures call perils to U.S. As many as 1/3 of the nation's 40 million school-aged children are at serious risk of failing in school and society, which would create massive urgent problems for the nation. Leaders of 11 education groups warned yesterday. Their coalition, known as the Forum of Educational Organization Leaders, said this potentially huge number of unproductive citizens will drain the economy in welfare and social service costs and seriously hamper the nation's ability to compete internationally. So here are our leaders, educational leaders, telling us to expect massive academic failure in the years ahead. Well, they should know. Here's an ad by General Dynamics. 1 out of 5 adult Americans is unable to read this sentence, or a warning label, or a job application, or a love letter. You see, more than 27 million adult Americans are functionally illiterate, and their ranks are swelling by more than 2 million every year. We're getting that production up there. You know, more functional illiterates are coming out of our schools that's doing a great job. It's the only thing they do well is producing functional illiterates by the million. Here's an article that was in Time magazine, Losing the War of Letters. We are creating a new generation of illiterates. That's what it says. How do you create illiterates? In the old days, an illiterate was somebody who didn't go to school. Didn't learn how to read. Today, you have to go to school to become an illiterate. And it isn't easy producing functional illiterates. You need specially trained teachers, special textbooks, special programs. It isn't easy keeping someone in school for 12 years and making sure that he or she doesn't learn to read. What do you do with them for 12 years? You know what you do? You pretend to teach. And that's what American education has become. The teachers pretend to teach, and the students pretend to learn. And it is now costing us for this charade. It's It's now costing us $231 billion. That's the school bill for the year 1990-91. 7.2% higher than last year. Incidentally, for this wonderful performance of teaching, teacher salaries have increased by 6%. K through 12 average teacher salary is now up to $33,300. We're paying $33,000 for somebody in a classroom to produce functional illiterates. Here's something. I'm quoting somebody, and I wonder if you can guess who this person is who says this. As many as 1/3 of the 26 million children in our nation's elementary schools face troubled academic failures. Millions will drop out. Millions more will simply tune out. Those 8.5 million youngsters need help now. Who do you think said this? No? Pardon? You're almost correct. It was Keith Geiger, the head of the NEA, president of the NEA. In other words, he's telling us that 1 out of 3 children will become functionally illiterate in our schools. In other words, 33% of the youngsters who entered the first grade today, or yesterday, whenever they started, are doomed to lead crippled lives, doomed by our school system. And there's not very much we can do about it, because they can take a child's brain and turn it into macaroni in 6 months. It's that easy to do. You know why? Because these methods of teaching, they weren't created by some little old lady in a garage in Buffalo. They were created by the world's leading behavioral psychologists. They were created by professors of education who inhabit these glorious campuses. 2 weeks ago, I was in Palo Alto, California, visiting Stanford University, and I visited the Elwood Cubberley Library. Elwood Cubberley was one of the great progressive educators who was basically responsible for this mess. And there in the hallowed halls of Stanford University, you know, the work goes on. It goes on at the University of Chicago, at Harvard, at Columbia University, all across America. All you have to do, if you want to find out what the educators are doing, you won't find it out by reading Time magazine or reading the National Enquirer. You know how you find out what the educators are doing? You've got to read journals of education. You see, every graduate school of education publishes a journal. Every professional organization and association publishes a journal. And those are not readily available to the public. You have to go to the university. You've got to go into the stacks and read that garbage. But that's the only way you can find out what their plans are. And I can assure you, that's my business. I read those journals. I can assure you that there is nothing that they are doing today that even remotely suggests that they are interested in high literacy in this country. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Gene Shaw is an exception. You have a few professors here and there who stand up for the truth. Dr. Gene Shaw, Dr. Pat Groff in San Diego, but they are very few and far between. There's Dr. Sam Peavy in Louisville, who spent years training teachers to do the wrong thing, and now he's repentant. He knows of the damage that he's caused, and he's trying to make good by helping the homeschoolers now. So 1/3 of those children who entered school yesterday and today in elementary school, the first grade, are going to have their minds destroyed. Here's an article from U.S. News and World Report. Nationwide, nearly 1 million students graduate each year unable to read and write, and 1 in 4 never graduates at all, and the problem has been getting worse. How can you graduate if you can't read and write? But they're graduating then. They can't read and write, but they're graduating. Incidentally, you've Heard of dyslexia, haven't you? It's that new disease that afflicts so many of the children. The other night when I was on the Kevin Joyce show, a man called up because I had been telling the people on the air that dyslexia is induced by the methods. It's caused by the teaching methods in the school. And so he called up and he said, Dr. Blumenfeld is absolutely wrong. My child has dyslexia. She's epileptic and she has dyslexia. And I replied, what has epilepsy got to do with dyslexia? I said, does your daughter speak? Oh, yes. Can she articulate? Oh, yes, perfectly good on that. I said, epilepsy has nothing to do with dyslexia. And then I asked him, I said, well, how was your daughter taught to read in the first grade? He said, I don't know. Well, that's it. He didn't even know how she was being taught. I can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the look-say method causes the symptoms of dyslexia. Now, before I go into that, let me first explain the difference between look-say and alphabetic phonics. A lot of people are not too sure what the difference is. Ours is an alphabetic writing system. Now, how do you teach an alphabetic writing system? Well, first you teach the child to recognize the letters of the alphabet. Step one. Step two, you teach the child the sounds that the letters stand for. Because what is an alphabet? An alphabet is a set of graphic symbols that stand for the irreducible speech sounds of the language. That's what an alphabet is. Russian alphabet stands for the sounds of Russian, the Hebrew alphabet stands for the sounds in Hebrew, and the English alphabet stands for the sounds in English. So, the second step is to drill the child in the letter sound so that the child develops an automatic association between letters and sounds. Now, for hundreds of years that was done in a very simple, mechanical way. And I'm sure that if any of you have seen Noah Webster's blue-backed speller, or any of the old books that were used in the 1830s and 40s to teach reading, you would have noticed that they taught the child the letter sounds in their consonant vowel combinations, such as they would drill them in bay, be, bi, bo, bu, may, me, my, mo, mu, ab, eb, ib, ob, ub, ap, ep, ip, op, up, that kind of thing. And when that was done, the child knew the letters, how to associate the letters with the sounds, and then could read words, could sound out the words, and then read little stories. The look-say method works entirely differently. Yes, they do teach the child to recognize the letters of the alphabet, usually, but then they skip step 2 and they go directly to step 3, and they teach the child what they call a sight vocabulary. Now, what is a sight vocabulary? A sight vocabulary is having children memorize words without their knowing that the letters stand for anything. As far as they're concerned, the letters are a bunch of arbitrary squiggles with no meaning at all. They have no idea why these letters are arranged in their particular sequence. And that's the way they're taught. Now, how does a child learn a sight vocabulary? Well, usually the teacher would start with first putting a little, we call this the configuration clue. We put a little frame around the word. Let's take, for example, the word horse, H-O-R-S-E. Put a little frame around to say, see the little horsey? Now, you and I know that H-O-R-S-E doesn't look like a horse. So how does a child see a horse in that frame? You know how? Any way he can. Maybe the H will remind him of a horse. Maybe the O, maybe the R, maybe the S, maybe the E. Nobody knows. There isn't a professor of education in the world who can tell you how a child learns a sight vocabulary, even though they're using it every day of the week of this time. Well, then they realize that that's not enough. You just simply can't put a little frame around it. So what they do is they provide picture clues. When they introduce the word horse, they have so many pictures of horses on that page that the child concludes, gee, that word must say horse. But then you can't always have pictures of horses every time you use the word horse. You've got other things to illustrate. So what they provide also are context clues. They'll use the word in a sentence such as, the man put the saddle on the, and the child will think, well, it could be a donkey, could be a camel, but it's probably a horse. Now, to reduce the ridiculousness of the guessing, and you'd be surprised at some of the things that kids guess, they also then teach phonetic clues. Now here's where things get confusing, because if you go to any school in America today, any primary school, where they're using whole language, and you ask them, do you teach phonics? They'll say, oh yes, we teach phonics. Of course we teach phonics. But that's not the intensive systematic phonics I told you about. That's not the step 2. What they do is teach phonetic clues. They'll teach a child beginning consonant sounds. They'll tell the child, well listen, if the word begins with H, it couldn't possibly be banana or baloney, but it could be house, hotel, hovel, hearse, or horse. Take your pick. Now, the leading professor of reading in the United States, one of the great honchos who has been propelling this whole language movement, Dr. Kenneth Goodman of Arizona University, he calls reading a psycholinguistic guessing game. And he told a reporter from the New York Times that if the child sees the word horse and says pony, that's correct, because he's seen the picture. You see, they are teaching children to look at each English word as if it were a Chinese ideogram. Now, notice the contradiction there. They're telling kids that if the word begins with H, it has to start with a word that has an H sound to it, but yet he says that if they say pony for horse, that's okay. It's a little confusing, I would say. Well, that's the way they teach children to read, and no wonder the kids aren't learning to read. How many words can you memorize? How many words can you remember in English as if they were Chinese ideograms? The Chinese can't even remember their own ideograms. It's very difficult. They have 70,000 of them. And they're required to memorize at least 5,000 of them before they want to read a newspaper. And for a Westerner, it's an almost impossible task. But the Chinese child is drilled and drilled and drilled. And I was told by a Chinese individual that it takes 6 years for a Chinese child to achieve what an English-speaking child achieves in 1 year with our alphabetic writing system. So why would we be using a method that is so poor, works, is so completely contrary to what our writing system is about? And why would we use a method that produces the symptoms of dyslexia? Now, what are the symptoms of dyslexia? Well, here are the symptoms. I have this article, Dealing with Dyslexia. Here are the symptoms. Errors in letter naming. Well, if you don't associate the letters with sounds, sure, you're going to make errors if the letters look alike. B's and D's, M's and M's, P's and Q's, T's and F's. Kids do that all the time if they don't associate that letter with a sound. It's just a squiggle. So, but that's a symptom of dyslexia, you see. Here's another symptom, difficulty in learning and remembering printed words. Well, how many of those words are you going to be able to remember by sight? Not very many, but that's a symptom of dyslexia. Here's another symptom, reversal of letters or sequences of letters in words. For example, B for D, was for saw. Well, that's a typical symptom, you see, because if you're taught to look at a word as a whole, and you're expected to remember what that word says, you will grab onto anything in that word that will remind you of it. It may be at the end of the word. It may be something in the middle of the word. Maybe something at the beginning of the word. You don't know. How do you look at a picture? When you go to a museum, you always look at the picture from left to right. Stand at this side of the frame and then work your way across. No, you don't. Something in the word, something in the picture attracts you. And you look at that first and then you see the rest. And that's what these kids are trying to do. That's why they read words backwards, upside down, any way they can, just to get, to see if something that will remind them, what does this word say? Now, a phonetic reader must read from left to right. He has no choice, because the letters follow the same sequence in which the sounds are uttered. You see. So he has to read from left to right. He has no choice. But a look-say reader can read any way he wants. So sure, if he's ambidextrous, left-handed, he'll read was for saw, pot for top. And then, of course, when it comes to spelling, Forget it. That's another symptom of dyslexia. Repeated spelling errors. Well, these kids just want to get a general idea of what the word, just enough letters, enough tall letters, a few letters, so that it looks like the word. Then it doesn't matter which sequence they're in. So what if the T is before the R or the T is after the R? It doesn't mean anything to them. They just want to get the configuration. As a matter of fact, the educators are now helping the kids greatly by this new method of teaching spelling called invented spelling. You heard of invented spelling? Oh, that's the new rage in the public school. You mustn't dare tell a child how to spell a word correctly because you're going to do something terrible to that child's self-esteem.
Right.
You're going to cause a trauma. So you mustn't tell a child how to spell a word correctly. And I'll show you the consequences of such teaching. A friend of mine told me this story. Her little boy was in the first grade. He has a little sister at home who is an artist. And so he wanted to create a sign for her saying, artist at work. So he drew the sign in school and he spelled work, W-E-R-C-K. Now phonetically, it works phonetically. So he took the sign to the teacher and she looked at it and she said, that's wonderful. What a wonderful sign. And she said, what does that word say, W-E-R-C-K? And he said, work. And she said, that's terrific. So he took the sign home and he showed it to his older sister. And he said, look at the sign I've made. Artist at work. She looked at it and she said, that's not how you spell work. He said, yes, sir. It certainly is. That's the way it's spelled. And she said, no, it isn't. And so she went to the dictionary and showed him how work was spelled, W-O-R-K. Well, that youngster was beside himself. He had been lied to by his teacher. He had been deceived by her. Do you think he can trust that teacher ever again? He learned the hard way. He was embarrassed. He was angry that his teacher should put him in such an embarrassing position. That's what they're doing in the schools these days. The kids are picking up every bad habit you could possibly think of. Here's another symptom of dyslexia: cramped or illegible handwriting. Now, I don't know what handwriting has to do with learning to read, but it certainly has a lot to do with the way they teach writing in today's schools. You know how they teach kids to write these days? They spend the first 2 years teaching them how to print. And